Hello, everybody. It is time for a review by themes, Unit 5. Again, we're going by major themes throughout this time period from 1844 to 1877. Political history, foreign policy, economics, religion, women, African Americans, Native Americans, immigration, technology. And starting with the biggest theme from this unit, political history. Now, the reason they choose the dates for this unit, 1844, I would say marks the election of James K. Polk. And James K. Polk was the president of Manifest Destiny. In the big picture, why it goes through 1877, the big reason for that would be 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. And that would kind of hint at the idea that Manifest Destiny leads the Civil War, leads to Reconstruction. And so that kind of wraps all these events up in a nice little bow. So let's look at the political history. Manifest Destiny is the belief that all the territory in North America, especially in mainland United States, was God-given territory to America. Most famous cartoon or painting you'll see is the angel leading the pioneers west as the Indians and Buffalo and other groups flee in front of us. So this desire to have Manifest Destiny got James K. Polk elected. His COIL plan included California and Oregon. And he was able to negotiate with Britain to split the Oregon territory, which led him focusing on California. To get California and the territory around it, he needed to provoke a war with Mexico. So Mexican-American War is a war provoked by the United States to gain more territory. We could go over the events over the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, but the truth of it is we pick the fight with them and we defeat them rather easily and end up getting a lot of land from them. Now, when the war is breaking out, a guy named David Wilmot in Congress suggests that in his proviso, he suggests that whatever land we gain from Mexico cannot be slave territory. So even as the war is beginning, many people saw this as a war by slave owners and powerful groups to gain more territory to expand slavery. His proviso was debated, not passed. And so when the war ends and we gain all of California and much of the Southwest, and the majority of Mexico's land, we are forced to go ahead and enter into a compromise. The 1850 compromise required a lot of agreements between the North and South. As all that land was gained, what are we going to do with it? California applies for statehood. Is it going to be free or is it going to be slave? Because it was actually split by the 36-30 compromise. So with that in mind, what the North decides to give up is they're going to allow a Fugitive Slave Act to become stronger. The South, meanwhile, will get, they get that added. Meanwhile, the North gets, or rather the South concedes California to become a free state. Just a second, let me pause it. So the Compromise of 1850 was not really a success for the South because they, even though they got that Fugitive Slave Act stronger, the North refuses to actually implement it. And so that leads to more and more argument and division between the North and the South. Other events lead to the Civil War. So if we're going to track what leads to the Civil War, you have the Mexican-American War, then you have the Compromise of 1850, and the next major act is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the major reason why this occurs is because a congressman from Chicago wants a railroad coming out of Illinois, and he knows he has to get the South on board. And so he offers up two territories that are supposed to be free because they're north of the 36-30 line. He offers them up to be chosen by popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty will not only lead to people flooding those states, especially Kansas, and fighting over whether it can be slave or free. Thus, you see Bleeding Kansas there, the event that is basically the beginning of the Civil War. But popular sovereignty also leads to a split between the Whig Party. So one of our political parties splits, North and South split, Kansas is split, and so we get more and more fighting and debating over the issue of slavery. The Republicans will eventually come out of the Whigs, leading to the Democratic Party splitting as well. All of these issues are splits over slavery, okay? So as the argument over slavery devolves into violence and eventually the secession of South Carolina and many other southern states, the Civil War is technically caused by slavery. And when Lincoln's elected, that's what caused those states to secede. So he said that he was not going to allow slavery to expand in his what we would call a free soil stance. With that in mind, as president, we don't really talk about much about the actual events of the Civil War, more about the bigger picture. He passes the Emancipation Proclamation as something that was going to free the slaves in the South, not areas that he owned, because he needed them to stay. He needed northern slave states or the border states to stay allied or loyal to the North. But the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in southern states. So that's a big step because it is the first time our government, even if it's not officially all of slavery ends, it is the first step they take towards ending slavery officially. Clement Vallandigham, he stands out because as we know today, there are people whose rights are being restricted in a time of crisis. People we are forced to stay home, and some people are getting arrested or are supposedly getting fined or harassed. Clement Vallandigham in wartime had his freedom of speech restricted. Clement Vallandigham spoke out against Lincoln. He was first kicked out of the country and sent to the South, and then he fled from the South up to Canada. So he represents the restriction of rights during times of crisis, especially warfare. New York City riots is a riot by Irishmen in New York City, and they are angry about the draft. The fact that the draft specifically allowed poor people to fight. They could not afford a substitute, and so men like these poor Irish immigrants had to go and fight for them, and so they riot, and unfortunately they target African Americans. So that kind of wraps up all the way through the Civil War. When the Civil War comes to an end, the South loses, and so when the war ends, there's a debate over how are we going to handle rebuilding our country in a process that we call Reconstruction. After Lincoln is assassinated, the belief that we could just simply allow the South back in is hotly debated between the president and Congress. Because President Johnson, who comes after Abraham Lincoln, he begins allowing what we call the Black Codes. Black Codes are where southern states passed laws restricting African American rights. So even though they were free, they could be forced to be farmers. They could not learn to read or write. They had to work on specific farms. They could not own a weapon, could not organize in groups without white people present, basically being returned to slavery. And because Johnson allowed that to happen, Congress gets quite upset. Now, the reason he allowed that, let's remember, was the idea that states should be allowed to handle their own business. And so this is a great example of states not doing what is right and the federal government having to get involved. Which leads us to Congress passing these amendments, nearly impeaching President Johnson. Those amendments, by the way, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, which Johnson did not fight. However, he did fight against the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal rights to all men and protection of those rights, among several other things. Johnson believed that law was discriminatory for specific groups, and so he fought against it and vetoed it. Then the 15th Amendment is also passed, which grants African Americans the right to vote. He did not fight against that one because Johnson had been nearly impeached by that point and knew that he did not have any power over Congress. So we see some positive gains for African Americans. Why are they able to practice these rights? Because we tend to think of the Jim Crow era, where blacks don't have their rights even though they're free. But for a short span of time in the South, they were allowed to practice these rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendment because of military Reconstruction. When Southern states would not do what the federal government had asked them to, Congress was forced to step in and send troops to ensure blacks had their rights. And this leads to the election of nearly a dozen African-American congressmen. That they all ran on the Republican ticket and gained election. This also leads to Southerners claiming that these are just carpetbaggers, that white politicians and businessmen came to the South to run for election. They protect African-American rights to vote, and then they just take power and money from the South. More complaints grow as President Grant has scandals in the early 1870s. The Southern continues to fight. We talked about the Ku Klux Klan. We talked about all kinds of the White Line, the Knights of White Camellia. And they have violence not only against African Americans, but also the carpetbaggers and other whites who supported Reconstruction. And then finally, this leads to the election of 1876. When does Reconstruction come to an end? And when is the South allowed to do what they please to African Americans? It comes to an end in 1876 when there is a tie in the presidential race. Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican candidate, and he and the Republicans agree that if they will allow Republicans to win the presidency, they will end Reconstruction. This allows Southern Democrats to regain control of Southern legislatures and Southern states. These are called redeemer governments. They were going to redeem themselves from from Republican control and return things back the way it used to be. Blacks have their rights taken away slowly and through things that we call Jim Crow laws, which are more prevalent in the following time period. So that kind of wraps up the African American portion, because the majority of the events in this time period have to do with westward expansion, which has to do with slavery, which then how do we deal with the end of slavery. We have some other important political events like the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act sold 160-acre plots of land for $10, encouraging people to move out west. The Pacific Railway Act encouraged expansion by building the first transcontinental railroad. And then mining also pulled people west. So not only the idea of the Homestead Act, but also mining in states like California, which became a state in less than 2 years because of the influx of people. So that kind of wraps up the political history. And as usual, everything in this time period can typically be tied to political history in some manner. So that brings us to foreign policy. How do we deal with foreign countries during this time period? Well, the primary foreign policy event is the Mexican-American War, where we fight Mexico to gain territory from them, which then sparks the debate over slavery. During this time period is also when we begin reaching out into the Pacific. Hawaii, China, and the Philippines all have American missionaries reaching out to them. Now, it's not in this time period we began taking control of them. These are the first groups to go out and establish relationships with these areas. The next time period is when imperialism truly begins. So, Matthew Perry, Matthew Perry opens Japan to trade by bringing our warships over there and our technology. China opens the trade after the Treaty of Wanghua. I'm sorry, guys, I have no idea how to pronounce that correctly. And then after the Mexican-American War, we're a little bit too focused on the Civil War and Reconstruction to do much else as it pertains to foreign policy. Okay? So foreign policy, Mexican-American War, and then the beginning of our relationships with many foreign countries, especially across the Pacific. As far as economics, Manifest Destiny was a big part of it. The poor people and many Americans moving out west to get a new start on homesteads, the expansion of slavery. The Southern demand for more land is what led to war with Mexico. And it was the economics that drove that decision to fight. Many economic differences develop and sow division amongst our country. So the South was dedicated to slavery. The North had no need for it, and so they were never going to agree upon that. The tariff is also an issue, as the South did not like tariffs, which protected industry. It only made their goods more expensive. And of course, the mistrust of banks that we've seen in previous generations continue to lead to fights. So these economic differences lead to division and eventually lead to the Civil War. Eventually, after the war, the South has to recreate its economy, because without slavery, they cannot continue in the way they had been. This leads to them forcing many freedmen to become sharecroppers. Even though the New South had some manufacturing in areas like Birmingham with its iron and steel industry, that still was predominantly an agricultural economy. So unfortunately for the South, even though they had a chance to rebuild themselves, they stayed dedicated to nearly the same economy. So what about religion? Well, it should not surprise you that religious objections to slavery are what add up to build towards the Civil War. Many religious groups after the Second Great Awakening gain more and more power and a voice during this time period. Probably the most famous piece that's used religion was Uncle Tom's Cabin. That book, released after the Compromise of 1850 and the increase of the power of the Fugitive Slave Act, led many Northerners to view slavery as just something they could not accept any longer. And that division led to, well, warfare. What about women? Women fight for abolition and women's rights. Last unit, I talked about the Grimke sisters, who combined both of those. You also have Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave who spoke about women's rights and abolition. But women like Harriet Beecher Stowe write books like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, one important woman fighting for women's rights in this time period is the famous Susan B. Anthony. And she had worked with Black leaders throughout all of this time period, trying to help both of them gain their rights. Unfortunately, when the 14th Amendment is written, it actually includes the word male. And then when the 15th Amendment is passed, it excludes women. And so Susan B. Anthony and her former close friend, Frederick Douglass, have quite a bit of a spat and fight over this, because she thought that they had been working together. But Frederick Douglass tells her that if they had tried to include women in these amendments, they would not have gotten the amendments passed. And he has a point, but you can understand why there is a division between the abolition and women's rights movements for a short time period following the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Regardless, women continue to fight and are denied their rights. What about African Americans? Well, quite frankly, the majority of this time period deals with African Americans, whether indirectly or directly. The Mexican American War was all about getting new territory, and slave owners viewed it as a chance to get more territory for slavery. Wilmot Proviso tried to deny slavery from being allowed in those new territories. The Compromise of 1850 increases the restrictions on fugitive slaves, which the North refuses to follow. California is added as a free state, Fugitive Slave Act. Again, this is the Compromise of 1850. Then Uncle Tom's Cabin sparks debate over slavery as a whole, especially the dividing of families, like Uncle Tom's family was divided in the book. Popular sovereignty is the idea that states should be allowed to choose their own laws. Specifically in this case, states had the right to choose between whether it was slave or free, which is what the Kansas-Nebraska Act was, which led to Bleeding Kansas. One figure I had not mentioned yet was John Brown. He's not an African American, but he was a radical who committed acts of violence to push against slavery, first in Kansas, the Potawatomi Creek Massacre, and then we attacked Harper's Ferry in South Carolina. And then one of the most famous court cases in our history, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Not only does the Supreme Court find that Dred Scott, who was a man owned as a slave, who had lived in free territory, not only do they say that even though he lived in free territory, he is still property by the Fifth Amendment, so he could not even sue for his freedom. They also undo all of the compromises, saying that Congress has no ability to decide whether or not slavery should exist in those territories. So other things for African Americans, of course, the Civil War fought really over slavery. Reconstruction tried to grant them their rights through the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, 14th Amendment, equal rights, 15th Amendment, rights to vote. Black codes after the war restricted these rights, but military Reconstruction undid those codes and protected them. Hiram Rebels is one of the most famous examples of a black congressman. The Ku Klux Klan resisted, tortured, attacked, intimidated, lynched, did all manner of evil things to African Americans in this time period. Unfortunately, when we look at this time period, even though a lot of rights are granted to African Americans, after this time period ends, we begin moving into what we call the Jim Crow era. That's because Reconstruction comes to an end and new laws are passed restricting their rights. So what about Native Americans? I've always summarized this kind of time period as we are dealing with our own business. So even though we have the Treaty of Fort Laramie guaranteeing the Sioux its own nation around the Dakotas, the U.S. is far more focused on solving its own issues of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. It's no surprise when Reconstruction ends that is when the Plain Wars begin and end by 1890, and we round up Native Americans. But during this time period, this is much more about us settling our own business with slavery, whereas the Native Americans were kind of an afterthought that we would deal with when we were done. So immigration, Irish and other West European immigrants flood the U.S. Chinese settle and build railroads in the West, and the frustrated Irish lead New York City draft riot. Immigration is not necessarily a focus of this time period, although they're involved in a couple events like the building of railroads and the New York City draft riot. It is the Gilded Age, which is the next era that we'll talk about them in a lot more depth. So they were very mildly included in this time period of manifest destiny and the Civil War. Technology, this time period is dedicated to build up the Civil War. So whereas we could go over the Transcontinental Railroad, and we could talk about the continued expansion of the market revolution and the canals and the trains and other things, but really the main focus is on the Civil War. The next time period, we'll see the American factory system pick up, and we'll see Gilded Age businessmen explode with new ideas like Standard Oil Company, Carnegie Steel, and other things. So the main focus of this unit, and it overlaps a couple of the others, is that political fight over slavery. First, Manifest Destiny, Mexican-American War, then the debate over what to do with this new territory. That fight leads to war. When the war ends, what do we do with slavery? And those are the kind of the main ideas that everything in this time period fits under. All right, so that is, in a nutshell, this time period. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.